Okay, recording has started. Thank you very much, Spencer, if you'd like to get going.
Okay, thank you all for inviting me to come do this. It was actually helpful going through things and kind of thinking things through again. You know, this is the kind of stuff that we, you know, kind of do by memory a lot of the time, and it's helpful to actually kind of go back to first principles from time to time. So, and thank you, Martin, for your help with this also. So just to talk about working group charters and milestones a little bit. Want to make sure everybody knows I am not and never have been a routing chair or routing AD, but I do evaluate and ballot on routing charters and recharters. There are BCPs that cover this, but philosophy and practice on charters and milestones does vary among ADs. So please interrupt if I say something and you say that's not the way we do things around here. That's perfectly good thing to interrupt for. Just to talk about kind of the BCPs that cover this for a minute or two. The big one is 2418 or BCP 25. That describes working group guidelines and procedures, and that BCP describes a charter as negotiated between a prospective working group chair and the relevant area directors. Says final approval is made by the ISG with advice from the IEB. And this is actually where we get this phrase from, that a charter is a contract between a working group and the IETF to perform a set of tasks. All of these turn out to be relevant as we're doing the charter and recharter process. Martin did make the observation that there is a draft floating around that is a major revision to 2418. If people want to take a look at it, you know, just to be aware of that conversation, so nobody's surprised if it does move forward. But 2418 is the one we got that's a BCP now. I'm advancing slides without saying slide numbers. Should I be saying slide numbers for anybody who's following along remotely?
We can see the slides, so I don't think you need to.
Okay, I didn't know. Some people can only get audio and then follow along some other way. So so I will not do that. But just what a charter contains is relevant administrative information for the working group. It specifies the direction or objectives of the working group, and describes the approach that's going to be taken to achieve those goals. And it enumerates a set of milestones together with timeframes for their completion. In BCP 25, we've got these sections that are described as part of a charter. The working group name and maximum character acronym, the chairs, the area and area directors, the responsible area director, the mailing list, the description of the working group, and goals and milestones. So if I go back to look at the most recent routing working group charter, it's here, just to kind of see that that's actually what's out there. So we see that that the beer charter does have chairs, it does have an assigned area director, does have a mailing list. Just to quote 2418 on what a description does, it's describing the problem being solved and discussing objectives and expected impact with respect to our architecture, operations, security, network management, scaling, and transition where that's applicable. So what the deliverables look like for beer is, initially chartered to do experimental work on a multicast forwarding mechanism as follows, and there's an architecture deliverable, and then there are 8 more deliverables. You can go look at the charter, but that, it's 1 through 9. And it also includes a description of coordination, that the working group is coordinating with several different working groups, and in this case is including the relevant other working groups during working group last call and relevant drafts. And then it calls out who is being coordinated with and about what, and what that looks like. That's not the only thing that appears in modern charters. We also see working group secretaries for working groups that have working group secretaries. We also see technical advisors. 2418 calls those consultants, but we've been calling them technical advisors for a while. The technical advisor is basically someone outside the area who is, usually outside the area, who is expected to provide guidance about something that the working group might not understand as well as it needs to do its work. The first working group I ever chaired was performance implications of link characteristics, which was in the transport area, and that got us Thomas Norton as a advisor, a technical advisor, because what we were doing was so closely related with the internet area. We've got opportunities to do additional URLs, and this is fairly recent. And so basically, you know, where's your wiki? Where's your issue tracker if it's not in the usual place? Are there other links that would be helpful for someone in the working group to know? And this is basically an unstructured set of URLs, so you can put what's out there that people need to know and why they might need to know it. So that gives a bit more flexibility than we've had even within the past, you know, more than a couple of years in the past. So that's gotten better. BEER does not talk about what's out of scope particularly. I see that in a decent number of charters. And Martin, I think, was kind of saying you don't see a lot of those in the routing area, you know, description of what's in scope, but not what's out of scope. And then BEER did not have any external liaison relationships, but a lot of working groups do, and it's helpful to recognize those in the charter as well, just to kind of keep everybody awake that that's going to be a expectation there. I never can say this often enough, I think, that external liaison relationships from the IETF side are often informal, and they may be formal from the other SDO side, you know, that they have a formal liaison that they appoint somebody to and put on web pages and stuff like that, and that doesn't mean that the IETF has a formal liaison relationship from the IETF side, but it doesn't mean, you know, we don't need one, and we don't need one in order to talk to people. So some of those external liaison relationships are formal, some of them are not from the IETF side. But that's like I said, that's what I see in modern charters these days. Just to talk about the charter process. Where charters come from, and this is from 2418 again, so you can establish a working group at the initiative of an area director or initiated by an individual or a group of individuals. I've seen, I think, like 1 or 2 working groups that were established at the initiative of an area director, or a couple of area directors. Probably DART was the most recent one I can think of, but that's not what we usually see. We usually see people proposing a working group to 1 or more area directors. So almost everything is coming in from a group of individuals. If you look at 2418 in section 2.1, there's about not quite 2 pages of criteria for formation that's helpful for you to be thinking about as you're writing a charter. as far as things that are suggested for area directors to look at. These days, like I say, IETF-wide, almost all requests to form a working group are coming out of a BOF, as described in RFC 2418, Section 2.4. That's not required. We can never say this too often. We charter about probably one working group a year without a BOF. That somebody puts together a charter, we look at it and say, that's so obviously the right thing to do that we should just go ahead and do it. The most recent one I've done with that was the TRAM working group, which was kind of follow on to the BEHAVE working group, which had concluded. And so we had a list of things that as people were doing NATs, seemed to come up over and over again that we needed to look at, and we made that list and then looked at it and said, that's obviously the right thing to do. We'll just go ahead and put the working group out, start the charter process for it without a BOF. We say, BOFs are a topic all their own. RFC 5434 is a good place to look for suggestions on that. Talk to your area directors, of course. So let's assume that you have a proposed charter. It's probably from a group of individuals. It's probably coming out of a BOF, and you're handing it to an AD. The first thing that happens is called, and I'm using the RFC 6292, which was the RFC that did kind of the requirements or statement of work for the data tracker for this stuff. So that there's actually some fairly detailed discussion in there of what's going on. So you start out at informal ISG review, which basically the area director goes in and says, I'm starting the chartering process. There's a button we push for that. And we're creating a working group record of the data tracker. It's the initial state. Some area directors put in a very early version of the proposed charter, and they cycled on a few versions there for a while. Others wait to create a working group record until they're pretty sure that they're going to take this work forward. So this might be more accurately described informal AD noodling, but the rest of the ISG can see what's happened, and anybody who knows that there's been an announced proposed working group record, the data tracker, can see what's happening. Normally, this goes to a state called internal review if the idea is accepted, or not currently under review if the idea is being abandoned. The internal review state is basically where the ISG and IAB are reviewing the charter. This is the initial ISG and IAB review, and we usually allow 1 week for that. In Spencer's opinion, the ballot question is, does this pass the lab test yet? One of the things that we're trying to do, I believe, more consistently in recent years is having conversations about proposed work that are more in front of the community than we used to. So talking about, we do things, and I did some of these, I was on the IAB slightly longer than I've been on the ISG. But from the IAB perspective, when I was on the IAB, you would look to say, oh, we're going to need to talk about liaison relationships for this, which is an IAB responsibility to do liaison oversight. And that level of discussion, not to talk about whether this is the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, or to talk about the deliverables in detail and things like that. My opinion. The ISG and the IAB do have flexibility on what seems to be the right thing on any particular charter review. So by default, the data tracker notifies the ISG and IAB that the proposed charter is entering internal review. Some area directors will add proposed chairs or even mailing lists to the notification list. Doing so blurs the line between internal and external review, which I talk about on the next slide, and it confuses people who see ballots multiple times because we actually ballot to send a document that a charter that is in internal review. We ballot it to go to external review, and we ballot it again after external review for approval to form the working group. So you'll see some people who, if this is happening, people see, oh, the working group is approved, and what was actually approved was sending it out for comments from the broader community. The usual next stage is going to be external review. This is where anybody outside the IB and ISG, you're usually seeing stuff. If the idea is adopted, or informal ISG review if you need more work, or not currently under review if the idea is being abandoned. External review means that the IETF community and possibly other standards organizations, development organizations, are reviewing the proposed charter. The usual next stage is ISG review, although it might move to not currently under review if it's abandoned during the external review. Think of this as IETF last call for working group charters. And you may see comments, and the comments can be from anyone. This is a lot like, like I say, this is a lot like IETF last call for a document would be. By default, you get IETF at IETF.org and the working group list. This is also where proposed work at the IETF becomes visible to other SDOs. The area director can specify whether to send the announcement to other SDOs for new charters. We almost always do that using the new work mailing list, which is one of the best kept, poorly kept secrets on the internet. This is basically a mailing list that is administered by the IAB, and it has representatives from different SDOs. I believe all the ones, well, when I was actually responsible for that when I was on the IB, so this was all SDOs that we had formal liaison relationships with. I don't know that that's true today. That's been about 3 years since I've known that. There's, from the IETF perspective, there's very little on it that's not on, also on the IETF Announce mailing list. So if you're subscribed to IETF Announce, you see everything from the IETF perspective. IEEE and W3C also send proposed work to, like incoming PARs and things like that, to new work as well. That's kind of the only other SDOs that transmit to that mailing list. At least, like I say, at least that's been true for a while. And then finally, work group exists. That the work group was approved by the ISG. The Secretariat publishes the charter, sends out announcements, and the working group remains in this state until there's a request to update the charter. So this is where the people who proposed the working group wanted to be. Why are you reading this? Do you have a working group? Get to work. Then not currently under review is kind of the catch-all state. This is where this is where things that aren't moving, that are not actively being reviewed and evaluated, end up. Not to say that you can't come out of not currently under review to some other state, but or to informal ISG review. But like I say, if this is something we decided not to do, that's going to be in this state. Any questions about any of that?
I guess I'd say a couple things. One is, in routing, so far at least, we haven't, that I recall, done a working group without having a boss. We haven't I guess we don't tend to add new working groups very often, so that's part of it. And then the second part would be that I think we probably have a little bit more of a lot of working group rechartering as opposed to necessarily, sorry, I take it back. I said we haven't. The new working groups that we've added without a boss were basically from the reorg work that Adrian and I did.
Yeah.
But other than that, we don't tend to add new ones without a boss.
Yeah, it really, you know, like I say, the ones that I've seen were typically in a space that we knew what the right answer was, and you know, for things that were not controversial. You can have a little bit of controversy during the external review. You know, if people say, no, we shouldn't do that, we should do this other thing over here. You know, but the BOF thing really is the opportunity for the entire community to be aware of something and say, what's the right thing to do? What are we really going to do? And like I said, I'm not surprised that routing, especially the last few years, has not created very much without a BOF. And like I say, that's not common. We do 1 or 2 a year usually, something like that.
Per area, right? Because I mean, I think security, I know we've been seeing a lot more without BOFs from security or apps. I guess one piece would be, and this is more for the chairs, right, that while we do usually have BOFs in routing, we've also talked about having virtual BOFs or other ways of sort of speeding up the process. And if there's clear work coming in that's interesting and necessary and so on, you know, there are ways of doing it so that the BOF process can be a little bit faster. But usually it takes some time to have those discussions and get the pieces nailed down.
Yeah, sure. So I should ask the other dumb question, which is second BOFs. Do you guys usually end up in second BOFs, or is one usually enough?
I think we usually end up with a second BOF often, from what I've seen.
Yeah.
I mean, Vigoureux didn't, right? JetNet had 2.
Yeah, I think it's very much a mixture. Spring also didn't. We did 1 BOF there, and that was more of a, yeah, we need a working group to organize it. So I think I'd say it's probably fairly evenly split between 1 and 2. It really depends on how organized the proponents are. I mean, I2RS also, we only had 1 BOF.
Everybody's quiet. I think you need coffee. Andy, any questions?
No, it's all been pretty straightforward so far.
Okay. Yeah, everybody's quiet.
That's okay. Let's keep going. I think there's some interesting pieces to talk about for when some of the rechartering aspects. One comment I would make about the original draft charter is, in my experience so far, proposed charters that come from the proponents for a working group don't tend to have the same types of restrictions and details and contained work that AGs, or at least I like to see. And so there usually ends up being a drafting, come back and draft. There's also always a balance of how much, I specify as process or preliminary types of documents make sense to do in a new working group versus doing additional ones for, you know, basically doing technical solutions or drafts that one could actually implement to. And again, that's one place where we've been steering a bit more towards have a charter that actually describes something that can get done in a couple of years and be implemented, not just architectures and problem statements and use cases and so on. and are trying to make better use of the wiki to keep track of things that are useful common knowledge but don't necessarily need to live on as permanent artifacts. So anyway, this is more on the new BOF, new working group side.
Sorry, this is Spence. I went away. I'm back now. And probably calling user 7, it looks like.
Yes, that looks like it.
Okay. So I slid to slide 20 to slide 20 on things to know. Especially for the chairs, if you see ballots to send the working group charter for external review, that doesn't mean you're finished. We mentioned this. The ballot positions look like the ones that we use for documents, except for one possible ballot position. When we talk about discuss in a draft ballot, that really is a request for discussion. The corresponding position in working group charters is called block, and that really is a block for charters. That people can be more one way, seem to be more one way about things that need to be worked through than on charters than on documents. And I guess that's not surprising, because you're chartering a significant chunk of work that's going to be occupying a significant chunk of time for a significant number of people. So maybe really important for us to get this right, as right as we can. We say at least one area director is to want to be the responsible AD for a working group. So this is not like, oh, we went through all the steps, so we get a working group right. Most area directors care what the community thinks about a charter most of the time, but remember that charters are not IETF consensus documents. This is when the ISG is steering. I've been involved in a couple of working groups where the area director had a vision that was not what the working group had, and it turns out that we ended up doing what the area director vision was. Any comments on that? How's it working routing?
We usually care. I mean, I'd say we care what the area thinks as far as what a working group should be doing. My impression is that there's a sort of a balance between what the proponents would really like to do and what the ADs think is feasible. But I think that's more sort of the ironing out the details of what's acceptable to be in scope, as opposed to tending to say this is the approach that needs to get taken, or so on.
Yeah, and I think I'm talking about a kind of a degenerate corner case in a lot of ways, but yeah, you do see documents from time to time where people are like, well, this is really not a great idea, but the ISG back a while ago chartered this work, and that was the contract between the working group and the IETF. So the time to have that conversation was then, not now. So we kind of have a deal, And nobody says things like that on charters. It's like, if this is a bad idea, it's a bad idea. Anything else?
No, I mean, just one piece. Actually, sorry, one quick thing is, yeah, I mean, on the bad ideas or on, what's in the charter is the contract. Absolutely. One of the things when we rechartered NV03 was sort of pulling apart the different work and the arguments that were being had in there about the different technologies that could be used to solve the same problem, and how many different ways do we want to have to do it. And one of the things that I found and was quite happy about really is that once you do the rechartering, you say, yeah, this solution is not happening in this working group because there's another place for it, or we don't need a solution like this because we have them already out there. The conversation goes away. The charter really taking the time to have the serious discussions and iron out the contract of what's going to be in the working group is really productive, because then it kills, and if you get the wrong charter or if you don't nail those disagreements down, it can kill a working group. And if you can get it nailed down early, then it's great. It lets the people who are trying to do the work actually focus and understand and agree on, what's in scope, what's out of scope, and not waste their time fighting off a lot of, oh, here's a bazillion different ways you could do the same thing.
That's actually a good question for me to ask. How it's done in routing, but I see some charters that come up and have. Like the working group will investigate these three things and then make a decision. Do you all do that very much, or do you tend to have those conversations before the charter?
I'd say probably before the charter. We don't tend to do a lot of investigate and then decide. We might... If we do that, I guess we don't tend to nail down to like these three things or these are the options. We might say, here's the problem statement, and everyone knows that there are several different options out there, but we probably wouldn't put it in the charter as choosing between them. Beauty contests can be painful.
Yeah, and especially once you've got the working group, there's the thing about an awareness of what goes on inside the IETF being visible outside the IETF. Like once you get a working group, then the expectation is something's going to happen and something's going to get finished and something's going to come out. Just for the working group chairs who may not have seen the article, the ISG kind of had a traumatic moment in the past, I guess, week, where we started seeing press reports about the .onion document, which we're quoting from our ballot positions in the data tracker. We were kind of
I haven't looked at those yet.
Holy crap! We thought that this was a relatively, and I mean, if you think about it, the data tracker, we didn't even, it used to be, we didn't even include the working group mailing list in the discussion on document ballots. So that really was a pretty quiet conversation, pretty private, and it's just not anymore. So being aware that as maybe not the whole world is watching, but some part of the world that is interested can be watching, and there's still a lot of people at the IETF that are kind of surprised when that happens. Anything else?
Not for me. Okay.
So just the thing on rechartering, very much like rechartering, the RC 6292 states are informal ISG charter review, internal recharter review, external recharter review, and ISG charter review. So recharter review. So kind of like I say, just kind of going through the analogous steps to the original charter. I would say area directors are more likely to approve recharters without external review if they're not very big. And if recharters are not sent for external review, they probably aren't sent to other SDOs either. So like I say, again, be aware of, there are things you may want other people outside the IETF to be aware of or not be aware of? And like I said, just recognize the linkage here between whether things go for external review and who notices. Area directors vary a lot on how much they want to revisit charters. I've been on the ISG a little over 2 years, and I see recharters for working for charters that are like 7 or 8 years old. That have not, that haven't been touched in a while. But other recharters that are much more recent, like every couple of years. So this varies a lot among ADs. It certainly varies a lot among areas. So I think this is a please ask your area director, is our charter still okay from time to time?
We do have some charters that have not been touched since antiquity, I think, is probably the best way of describing it. No, I mean, like the ISIS one, I think, is probably at least 15 years old. And so there are some cases there where, I am looking at, and part of the reason we're having this training and discussion is that I do think it's productive to update and clarify what some of the various working groups are doing, and just clean up their charters a little bit so they connect in a little better.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing about, we talk about trying to make sure that the IETF is not impenetrable to people who are coming in from the outside or people who are starting to participate for the first time, to be able to have some idea what goes on around here, and even more broadly, what kind of, are you getting started? Are you almost finished? Those kinds of things, which we probably talk about more on milestones even. But so, we say, rechartering can be a fairly heavyweight process, so at least ISG review. But the thing about a rechartering is that it's helping to avoid late surprises from other areas. I just got a request from a working group to do a recharter for 2 work items that both look like they'll be fairly controversial in other areas. So the fact that we do a recharter and have this discussion before the work gets very far, and we'll try to work out some of the issues across areas and things like that, really is, late surprises are, like one of my least favorite things. I think that's true for a lot of people. So, the thing with rechartering, if you think of it as an opportunity to make sure that everybody knows what you're doing so that you have unpleasant conversations early rather than, after IETF last call, which is sometimes when we have them. Any questions? I had a little section in here that I stuck in on what not to do with charters. There's a television show my wife likes to watch called What Not to Wear, a fashion show. So this is like what not to do. So we have these like classic fails in BOF requests, which include charters and so subsequently charters. And one of them, is not a surprise, boiling the ocean. We do short-term and limited scope. That's what we say we prefer. In routing, we have a few long-lived, very long-lived working groups, OSPF, IDR, and ISIS, being the ones that I tripped over. But that's usually not what we're looking for. If you're trying to get work chartered so that you can get underway, short-term and limited scope is probably the best way to go there. I should probably stop and let the area director say, yes, that's the way we do it in routing, or no, we don't, for each one of these.
Sorry. Hi. Yeah, so yes, short-term and limited scope is a lot of how we'd like to do it. It's also true that we have a lot of protocols where essentially we have groups that are doing maintenance and extensions, like OSPF and IDR and ISIS. And of course we say maintenance and extensions, but some of those are rather substantial and important critical changes. But in general, for new working groups, we try and do short, limited scope and see how it goes. And yes, trying to decouple down from this is an architecture or a product, what's necessary, to these are the protocols or pieces that are necessary, definitely helps. We don't have a lot of Swiss Army knife ones yet, but they are, we do have some, and sometimes it's, well, okay, like we have CIDR, obviously, which is sort of the security border one. You can argue about things like SFC and even I2RS and so on for being on the border. I guess I'm a little bit more open to border ones because routing tends to touch a lot of different things. They have to be really clear about what they're doing and why it's in routing versus elsewhere is how I'd say.
Yeah, we got on the Gordian knot one. I get this a lot, and like I say, keep in mind I'm talking about this as much from my experience on the IAB as on the ISG. That you know, you get stuff with people coming in saying we want to build this. And what is this, you know, whatever this is, what does this have to do? Well, it has to do, you know, it has to be able to do this, and it has to be able to do this, and it has to be able to do this. And so you get a proposed charter that says, you know, this will be a whatever the heck this is working group, and it will do, you know, it will do what you need to do there. And the most recent one of these that I've been through in any kind of detail. So it's like there was an interface where you were going to be, so actually, well, I2NSF. So there was, there's an interface to devices that you're actually trying to control. So that's one set of expertise. There's an interface to the operator interfaces and things like that, and there turns out that they were thinking kind of that's like an HTTP or a RESTful interface or something like that. You know, it was completely different technology. The expertise you need to do that is not at all what you need to do to download policies into network elements. You know, or to know what kind of policies you need to do there and stuff like that. So you know, chopping that up and saying, well, you know, this work could be done completely separate from this other work over here. And, you know, and we talked, and they had like 3 interfaces, and if you had 2 of them, you could still do, you know, if you had the first interface, it would be useful. If you had 2 of the interfaces, it would be very useful. If you had all 3 of the interfaces, it would be perfect, but you didn't have to have all 3 interfaces to get anything done. So, you know, those were the kind of conversations we were having there, where you say, well, you know, that's very interesting that you need to do those 7 things to do your product. What can be separated out? You know, what communities are involved in each one of those things? Are they the same communities? Things like that. And, you know, you may get a good, you may end up with a charter that's a big chunk of work, but if you don't have to, it will be easier to manage, and it will be easier to get chartered. I assume your documents will be less horrific. And I also should say, I don't know what the routing experience has been, but like in at least 3 areas that I've been active in, working groups tend to be not able to do a lot of different things at the same time. So if you can take some of this work and put it in another working group, then you'll actually be able to get the rest of the work done faster, and the other working group may get their stuff done faster rather than try to do it all at once. The extreme case was the stuff that we were doing in SIP, where they had so many things coming in that they said, we're only going to do this many extensions at once because we can't understand more than 4 or whatever the number was. And so basically when one of the extensions we're working on now gets finished, then we'll add the next one. Actually start working on the next one. And so you should be doing what you can to get the other ones finished so that we can make room for yours. So like I said, that's the extreme extension of trying to do a lot of stuff in one working group. But the RI area now, the art area, doesn't do it that way anymore. But that's the way it started out when SIP was young, was with SIP and SIPing working groups. The Swiss Army knife, you really do get topics that are on area boundaries. The big one that I've got, and you mentioned CIDR probably as an excellent example. In the transport area, TCP Inc. could just as easily, so this is increased security for basically opportunistic security for TCP. This could have just as easily been done in the security area with, it's about a 51%, 49% overlap. So, if the wind had blown the other direction, that would be a security working group. But it's in transport. So we understand that there really are working groups like that. But I've also seen proposals that, again, this was the, let's just say cloud. We're going to have, cloud request routing, and we're going to have cloud configuration, and we're going to have cloud security. And this all came in on one charter. So it's basically everything that you would need to do to build cloud products and run cloud networks. And that came in as one charter. So we don't know how to do that. We just don't. So things we see like that just don't happen. So kind of be aware of that. And the plea for the people who outside the routing area and maybe even outside your area of expertise who will be evaluating your work. 12 of the 15 people who could state ballot positions on your charter are not routing area directors. That doesn't begin to count the people who can comment on it in other areas of the IETF, or even especially for some of the work you all do, people in other SDOs. So just making sure that you have a charter that's clear to people who are not totally skilled in the art is probably a good investment of time as well. We're finishing up one charter where we probably spent, I don't know, maybe 8 months trying to get the charter in a way that people could understand it who weren't working on the work that they were trying to charter. So, you can spend a lot of time not getting that done. So if you start out thinking other people are going to have to be able to read this to evaluate it, you'll probably come out way ahead. Any other comments on this?
Separate, yeah, I would say the Gordian knot is sort of really a trade-off of the time, that the working group has, because we've seen several times in CCamp, we try to keep the work together on the different technologies so that we could have commonality in the protocol. Then it also means that, sometimes there's a heavy workload there, and then other times a lighter workload. And we did the same with MPLS TP. We decided to keep it in MPLS, so it meant pretty heavy load there for a while, but now it's getting lighter again. So there's trade-offs both ways, because if you don't keep it within a working group, you could really get split off, and then you don't get the leverage to have really a commonality.
Yeah, you're talking about the commonality, you're talking about the expertise that's necessary to do the work, you're talking about the level of review that's required, especially for some of the things in the routing area. So there are reasons to have big chunky working groups, and you just named several, but like I say, recognizing that makes things harder. That may be the right trade-off. Maybe it was never going to be easy, but just to be aware of the trade-off so that you're making the trade-off that you want to make.
Yes, Spencer, I agree. I'm just thinking that you need to really look at the different trade-offs and then get involved with the AD, with the chairs to try to figure that out. In OSPF, we don't have AC, but I'm sure he would have remarks on using his. But yeah, I agree.
So where's Cheryl this week? Anyway, sorry, muttering to myself. Anything else on that one? We'll just talk about milestones for a few minutes. If there's anybody on the call that milestone is your favorite topic as a working group chair, I really feel sorry for you, and probably sorrier for your working group. The theory on milestones, that they are managed the same way as the rest of working group charter, but they're a little different. They're a contract between the chairs and the area director, not between the working group and the IETF. So the initial milestones are often entered by ADs. Milestones are maintained by the chairs with AD approvals as needed. Most milestone changes are not reviewed by the ISG unless an area director really wants the rest of the ISG to know about something. And it's getting a lot easier to keep dates updated than it used to be. Before the data tracker allowed working group chairs to maintain dates and mark things done and stuff like that, the only way you could get anything done was sending those to your AD, and that never ends well, right? So we said, you can add them, you can change them, you can delete them with AD approvals. The dates can be changed without AD approval. More than one draft can be associated with a milestone. I think a lot of people know this, but a lot of people forget this when they're writing charters. So, like I say, recognizing that that's not a one-to-one mapping. You can associate drafts with milestones without AD approvals. It's worth mentioning some working group chairs use milestones to guide what work to do, what the working group will work on next. You saw the beer charter, so they've got like 9 deliverables or something like that. So one thing you could do is you could have active milestones for all 9 deliverables at once. Some other working groups might have 4 of the milestones entered into the database and say, this is what we're going to work on until we finish these. And we may want sometimes that's a you should have your requirements before you start working on solutions. Sometimes that's a we just really want to do flow control so that we don't have. I actually have a working group that I'm responsible for right now where they probably have like, I don't know, 7 milestones or something like that, and they have like 7 author teams that are all working on their own drafts, and like nobody's reading anybody else's, and so like maybe that's a little too scattered to get good progress and get good reviews. So, like I said, there'll be different reasons that you might not have active milestones for all your deliverables at once. But I say again, that's a trade-off thing just to think about. A thing that's been coming up more and more frequently, and probably it's been going along enough now for a year or two to where many people have seen it, but not all. The ISG has been talking about having working group deliverables that are not published as RFCs. Use cases probably being kind of the classic example, and there are some case, everything is trade-offs. In a couple of cases, we've had this question come up, and the answer was, well, these use cases are really coming in from another SDO, and we need to make sure the other SDO understands that we're taking them seriously, and things like that. So there may be reasons to do it, but like I said, just recognize that working groups can work on things that don't come out as RFCs, that are within Charter, that are important as part of what they're doing, but that you don't have to publish everything that you do. Any questions on that?
About this one. The main reason to publish something is that so it gets into the permanent record. And if you don't publish something, then there's the opportunity for it to become lost in the gray depths of time. And right? And so
yeah,
then
sure.
lose sight of why the work was done in the first place or what the requirements were, and why wouldn't you want those things recorded for posterity?
Right. So, so the question is basically how badly do you need that? Recognizing that the cost of producing RFCs, and honestly, we never talk about it much, but there's a cost to doing IETF last calls and things like that, because you're using up people's resources who theoretically could be working on other stuff that needed, could be reviewing stuff that had to be published. We get some publication requests that are kind of like, well, these people worked really hard on this document, so it should come out as an RFC so they can tell their bosses they published an RFC. And I mean, we recognize that that's a thing, but trying to make sure that we have good reasons to do the things that we do, recognizing that we probably don't have a canonical list of why things are good reasons or bad reasons. A lot of this is judgment. But I think you can expect more conversations in the future than you've had in the past about, does this document need to be published as an RFC?
I guess I would add a couple things there. One is, frequently, when a use case, you first write a use cases draft, you haven't figured out all the solution, you're trying to figure out some of the requirements and derive requirements from the use cases. And sometimes it's useful to keep that use case information, and sometimes, a year or two on, it's become obvious that the results or the benefits of that information are captured. I also feel that there was being a tendency, particularly in some working groups and particularly in routing, to have a lot of use case drafts, and the working groups were spending a lot of time, some of the working groups were spending a lot more time and focus on getting the use cases because they were perceived to have, I think, a lower barrier to entry, instead of actually, say, working on the solutions. And since at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the use case is, if there's nothing that's implementable from what the working group's doing, there's not much point, right? So it's okay to have a use case document that really helps articulate where the requirements come from. It's okay, and have that go forward and be published. Sometimes it's better to keep your use cases living because as time goes on with the solutions, you're seeing different requirements coming out, and the architecture or solution already describes the requirements based on the assumptions. You don't really need the use cases anymore. At least that's how I see it. I'm happy to chat about it more.
And I've seen, and you know, the reflection of this is in BOF agendas, of course. So you know what I would hope for in BOFs that I'm the responsible AD for is that there's some reason why we're doing this proposed, you know, why we would do this proposed work. But if there's one compelling reason why we would do this work, maybe we don't need 34. Because, you know, like I say, I mean, I see, you know, especially IAB guys tend to go to as many BOFs as they can because architectural oversight is one of their charter responsibilities. So I've sat through a lot of BOFs, and I've sat through BOFs where like getting through all the use cases kind of swamped everything else in the BOF. So yeah, use cases are great. Yeah, you may need to, you may need a few. There may be political reasons why you have the ones you have. Making sure that everybody's signed up to support this work and not go off on their own, and things like that. But like I say, just recognizing that, as we say, you know, working group deliverables might not be published as RFCs. Andy mentioned the thing about, you know, things being lost in the midst of time, and that's a thing. You know, that's certainly the way we've traditionally thought about things during my time at the IETF. Things that you can do to help that, even putting things in the RFC series, well, somewhere in the 8,000 RFCs, you might be able to find, you know, the reason why we did things and stuff like that. But you know, if you have some working groups, the TCPM is one. I think it was published by the SIP working group, but basically doing like the Hitchhiker's Guide to SIP or the TCP roadmap, or you know, things like that. They kind of describe what's out there and why it's out there and what's a good idea and what's a bad idea and things like that. The other thing. I think it's worth saying, you know, we have. I wish we did more trying to explain design rationales than we do, but we don't necessarily have to do that in a working group consensus document. You know, we do have an independent stream that, you know, having things come out and say, you know, putting together a document that says this is why we did it this way. You know, that's perfectly, perfectly reasonable thing. Comes out as the opinion of the authors, not, you know, the working group had a consensus that this is the reason why we did it, or anything like that. So, you know, remembering that as long as we have an independent stream, we might as well use it.
So I had a question about milestones, Mike.
Okay.
And I actually did, I don't know if I'm the only one or the WebEx completely failed for it, but anyway. So I've noticed a certain reluctance on certain working groups for what I call finish milestones as opposed to start milestones. So they created, particularly with use cases, they create a dependency that you have to do all the use cases before you can go into the solution space. And I've tried to motivate that I think this is the wrong way and actually is destructive to the working group's energy. And that what I would claim is that you can't publish the solution document until you finish the use case document. But they could get published on the same day. So the point here is that you may need to leave the use case document, assuming that you're going through the whole process with it, or the requirement document, some people call it. You have to keep it open, really, until you've actually finished the solutions, because you may actually decide that some of the requirements were out of scope or were wrong or you missed some. And that I actually think this, I wish people, I don't know if there's some people feel this is a wrong way to do it, but to me it seems like it would preserve a lot of the energy of the working group and more or less avoid serializing everything.
So you mentioned the serializing everything, and I don't know what extent routing area is trying to get out of the waterfall business, but very much the linear. Well, we'll do these drafts, and then we'll do the use cases, then we'll do the problem statement, then we'll do the requirements, and like that, and like you say, people are kind of somewhere between impatient or just going off and solving the problem their own way in the meantime. So it's definitely something to be thinking about. I mean, and like I say, the practice differs across areas, but I am seeing I'm seeing area directors who are pushing more towards yeah, we need to have this in the wiki, yeah, it needs to be up to date. Everybody needs to be able to see this. Because this is kind of what we're working to, but once we've got the solution, maybe we don't care what maybe we don't care at a IETF consensus level of intensity about preserving why we did what we did. I mean, like I say, recognize you're talking about IETF review kind of stuff, does the IETF have consensus about this? And, on a standards track protocol specification, yeah, we probably should. Should the IETF have consensus that all your use cases make sense? Maybe not. So like the level of review is doesn't even have to necessarily be the same.
So you're saying that you don't think that use case documents should necessarily go through the process or be the same level of consensus, and I think that's a really useful thing to communicate, because I think that we've set the bar too high, and it takes energy away because people argue, well, I don't want to solve that use case or whatever, but
yeah, so there's that.
Well, there's solutions that don't always solve everything, but then there's people that want to keep the list of use cases very short so that they don't have to worry about everything.
Right. So recognize that I spent a certain a certain amount of time in transport, so the list of use cases for TCP is actually quite long. So that would have been the wrong answer. And like I said, my deal is not to sell you what the right answer is. My deal is kind of to talk to you about what I see different area directors doing, including myself, but I'm one of 15, and kind of help people think in terms of what are the trade-offs. We do, I will tell you, we do get an awful lot of proposed charters that are, waterfall straight off the bat. It's like, step one is here's the use cases, step two, here's the problem statement, step three, here's the requirements draft. And I mean, like, a certain amount of this stuff was supposed to happen before the BOF was approved, right?
Yeah, I will add on that I believe my next description for the waterfall model is I utterly loathe it and think that it can be a really good way of killing the energy and momentum in a working group and the enthusiasm. I think it's really critical for working groups to rapidly get to the point where they have technology, where they're talking about technology that can be implemented. And if you spend too long talking about use cases and so on, or architectures or problem statements, it becomes a real problem. I don't think it makes sense. It's not the case that we're doing waterfall. We're doing feedback loops between use cases and requirements and solutions. And, having it scheduled that way makes sense. Certainly, I push back on charters and BOF requests that are trying to describe, basically, they don't have work that's actually going to be implementable in the next year or two. I think it's really important to get that moving.
Yeah, back to the short-term deliverable, short-term limited scope conversation that we were having earlier. And I would just say this also. I remember vividly being in front, talking to Bob Brayton at the first London IETF, so that would have been, what, like 2001 or something like that. I was complaining bitterly about the number of working groups at the IETF that were off in the lands of requirements drafts and use case drafts and problem statement drafts and everything like that, and weren't actually producing anything that we could implement, that my company could be implementing. And Bob said, was it not obvious to you that we started asking people to produce those documents so we could slow them down long enough to figure out if they were crazy? And I'm waiting for gas, but I figure you're mostly on mute. But I was so taken aback by that I never had the nerve to ask him if he was kidding.
As much as you, Spencer, I've seen the amount of process work grow over the years, and I do think it's a risk aversion problem. It's what if we're getting this wrong? What happens? And you know what? At the end of the day, if we get it wrong and we move on. In my mind, it's much better to charter a working group that goes, explores, comes up with something, and there's plenty of time to say, oh, this is not doing well. And it's also better to go and say, nah, I'm sorry, you're not ready yet. I don't know what you're thinking about here. It's not clear enough. Go away and do more work before it's time to do a real BOF or before it's time to turn it into a real working group. Either of these, I think, require, well, decisiveness and a willingness to take risks. And we, particularly in routing, I feel, we've gotten away from being willing to take risks and do new work, and that's unfortunate. I mean, obviously, we do a lot of good new work, but it tends to be building on existing technology, and we don't have a lot of really radical pieces going on.
Mm-hmm. And like I said, maybe the routing guys and the transport guys are not the ones that you want to have being the risk takers. At least not routinely. Let's see what happens when you do this.
Oh, sure. I mean, careful, well-considered risks.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I was leaving out the adjectives.
Well, but beer, for instance, I mean, it's charted as experimental because it is doing some risk-taking. It's saying, here, what if we have a whole new way of forwarding? And what could we do with that? And, maybe it will go forth and be really useful. And I'm sure that, as Tony's about to say something, that it really will go off and be really useful. But at the very least, we can give it, we chartered it as experimental so we can give it a try and explore it and give it a chance to grow. Because at the end of the day, if it's an experiment, people do it. We learn something. If it succeeds and flies, that's awesome. And if we don't give it a chance, then we're never just going to find out if it's good.
So the first time this morning, things start to get interesting. That's why I woke up. So we're not talking bean counting. Not sure that's the scope of the discussion. Not sure that it's the scope of the discussion. But this is what will decide, in my opinion, whether IETF will lose relevance or not, okay? Yeah, so yeah, we are piloting procedures, and I mean, I didn't start laughing about this stop the crazies. Oh, I do that a lot. If you grow an org big enough, something becomes successful enough, it attracts from the original clueful bunch a lot of people with all kind of, the bad and the ugly and the crazy. So you start to put procedures in place, right? And you shortcut them when things are good, and otherwise just pile these things on people until they go away or socialize, right? Start to understand that certain things are unavoidable. As to taking on the new risks in the routing area, yes, Frankly, my assessment over, oh, AC is not on, so I can say something. The only guys who were crazy risk takers were IDR, right? That's why they won. They were breaking the rules by the bucket, and they were putting stuff in DGP for which they were drawing fire. I mean, sometimes they got too excited, and like the MED partial order was not a good thing, but they put a lot of stuff which made IDR incredibly relevant, right? And I think the same thing is true for the routing area. Beer, well, it's kind of a low-hanging fruit, right? Because a lot of work has been done up front. And believe me, Aliyah, before we brought it on, I told the guys about 3 times that it ain't gonna work. And a couple of PhDs read it all the math because I didn't trust it at all. You know, we had this discussion about the trickle guys or whatever they Babel or whatever they call these things. Yes, IETF has to allow these things, right? We have to give them some kind of a framework, but we have to take risks. We have to be experimental. Guys like IDR or ISIS don't have it all. The world changes. It has proven incredibly successful, right, for 20 years, and it's a very difficult problem to figure out those things, but it does not mean that the world stops there, right? The procedure is good to stop the crazies, but the procedure should not be used to stonewall people to come in with new thinking. We should give them a chance. We should let experimental stuff. It's better to run too much experimental stuff that squeeze the one that will matter, because then someone else will take over the world. I mean, the lessons from Silicon Valley. Yeah, I guess that completely blows the scope. But, you know, since Aliyah expected me to chime in some pretty off-the-beat way, here I am. And I'm not completely coherent, but it's 8 in the morning for me, so bear with me, okay?
So I appreciate it. And that's not out of scope because, I mean, we talk, why do we have charters and milestones? To say what we're doing, to help steer the work the IETF is doing, to encourage, and we talked about project management earlier. These are all tied together. Charters and milestones are a tool, the mechanism we have for saying, yes, this is what we're going to go do, and by the way, this is how fast we think it's going to get done and what has to happen. And if we try and look at it just from the process mechanics without thinking about the meaning behind it, then that's a problem. And I think one of the messages is absolutely that certainly I and the whole IASG, I think, since I came on it, are aware of and interested and willing to do things that are not, oh, you must jump through this hoop. So while in routing, we don't tend to we haven't chartered new working groups generally without having BOS. We have the capability to do so, and or to have a virtual BOS between IETFs. And you know, I'm extremely open to that idea if there were actually work where that made sense. And also, I'm very much in the, you know, you can't tell if an idea is going to work or not if all you're doing is the use cases. You've got to get down into the meat of stuff that's actually implementable. If there's enthusiasm, you know, the worst thing to do is to kill it off. Anyway, I guess that's my treatise. But so what I say is, right now, Spencer, I guess, if there are any more questions, we have been recording. Sorry, Spencer, did you want to wind up?
This is
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I've been mulling over the question of, do requirements, use cases, or a similar sort of thing that comes up in the security area a lot is threat models. Do they really need IETF consensus? And perhaps not, but if you produce a protocol and, well, in the first place, going through the IETF last call, if the problem statement isn't sufficiently detailed, how are people who review the protocol draft supposed to decide whether it's solving a useful problem or whether it's actually solving the problem? And so I'm trying to say that I'm trying to think of a place there would be to publicly put the use cases, requirements, threat model, yada, yada, that would be archived so the protocol implementers later would be able to look at those also as they were doing their implementations. Do you see of a way to do that? A place to record those sorts of groundwork that underlie the protocol design so that those people who are doing the IETF last call and people who are later trying to use or implement the protocol would have as a reference?
Well, that's part of what the wiki can be very usefully used for, particularly if it's going to, change across time. I'm not completely pro, or I'm not pushing for no use case RFCs. I'm pushing for a very limited number if they're really if and when they're really necessary.
Yeah, I wasn't really trying to object. I was trying to say, are there places which are publicly available and archived? Would the wiki satisfy that? That's fine. I'm all for the wiki and making it changes as you go along. I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I'm just concerned about the publicly available and archived part.
Well, it's publicly available. Is it archived? I guess you can argue. Certainly the web page is backed up, and changes are recorded. There's a change thread that happens, but that's kind of a mixture.
I think you're running into a more fundamental issue, and I'm going to track this back to issues that we have as just sort of a general software engineering thing for long-lived projects. What you're sort of asking for is basically some trail of the thinking and the architecture and the everything that led you to produce the document that you did.
Mm-hmm.
Just like if you're writing software, it's sort of nice to actually have some sort of master architecture document to allow you to pick it up and read it the first time and understand what's going on. But for exactly the same reason that those are often not maintained, at companies, it takes time. It is a distraction for people actually doing the real work, and it's really only beneficial for the people who aren't actively doing work at the moment. They tend to get left behind. So while I agree with you that having that sort of thing would be incredibly useful, especially for, to pick on like long-lived protocols like BGP, where a lot of the things that are in the RFCs to some extent are just lore that if you don't understand why you got there, it makes no sense whatsoever. It's a hard thing to ask people to do.
Well, the going forward and maintaining the currency of those documents is one thing. But I was thinking just, if you were trying to use BGP, does it suit my particular purpose? As I'm implementing it, I got a choice here of how to implement it. I'm just thinking of the philosophy underlying the protocol, all those sorts of things. Where would you keep them? And,
well, implementations are even uglier because ideally, if you're writing good documents, they're black boxes in terms of how the internals work. Yeah. Depending on your protocol, some things will probably be common solutions that people arrive at just simply by looking at the black box. But some of them, people will come to completely different conclusions about how they should be architected. The most common BGP implementations on the net, anything from open source on through the proprietary ones, have taken amazingly different paths, for things as simple as the BGP routing tables, the ribs. Yeah. And trying to actually spell those things out means that you have to not only expose, what the thinking was at the time, but, what sort of impact was on the rest of the ecosystem. That's really part of the problem with trying to answer this big architecture problem, especially for implementations, is that your answer will depend on the ecosystem that you're trying to fill. And that's going to vary considerably, and it's going to age over time.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand your motivation for asking. I just don't know if there's ever going to be a good answer for getting that sort of thing written down. You know, honestly, it's the kind of thing that you know, if we happen to have enterprising graduate students trying to understand protocols, that would be a good thing for them to try to do, because they'll write it down, they'll get it horribly wrong, people will correct them, they'll get something useful out of it, and you know, we'll get that sort of snapshot.
Yeah.
But trying to ask somebody to take no time out of their day jobs to go back and sort of do what appears to be busy work is sort of tricky.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think the answer was there's no good answer.
I agree.
Okay.
Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.
Thank you all for having me.